Très bien, donc on recommence avec le séminaire, le dernier séminaire de cette année, qui sera présenté par Dominique Sportiche, professeur à UCLA à Los Angeles. Dominique étudie aux États-Unis, à MIT, il y a quelque temps. Et donc, Dominique est un grand spécialiste de théorie syntaxique. Il a donné toute une série de contributions marquantes, en particulier sur des questions comme la position thématique des sujets à l'intérieur du prédicat, l'analyse des quantificateurs flottants, l'analyse des clitiques, l'analyse de l'accord, puis plus récemment la théorie de la reconstruction. Donc le fait que s'il y a un mouvement, les éléments bougés se comportent par rapport à certains phénomènes comme s'ils n'avaient pas bougé. Et puis aussi la théorie du liage, les dépendances anaphoriques. Et son séminaire d'aujourd'hui va porter sur ces questions. C'est un travail fait en commun avec Isabelle Charnavel de l'Université de Genève. Donc merci d'être ici.
C'est moi qui vous remercie de m'avoir invité. Je vais commencer ma présentation en français, mais à un moment, je vais basculer vers l'anglais parce que c'est assez difficile pour moi de parler de l'anglais en français. Donc, quand ça va devenir technique, je vais passer à l'anglais. Cette présentation, donc, ça porte sur la théorie du liage, mais pas seulement. Je suis particulièrement heureux de la faire ici, invité par le professeur Luigi Rizzi, parce que en 2012, au congrès international de linguistique à Genève, Isabelle Charnavel et moi avons fait une présentation sur la théorie du liage. Et à la fin de cette présentation, le professeur Cinque de l'Université de Venise et le professeur Rizzi ont posé une question à laquelle on n'avait pas de réponse. Et la présentation d'aujourd'hui, c'est un petit peu la réponse à cette question. Et quelle était cette question? Dans les langues naturelles, il existe des dépendances entre positions. C'est-à-dire que si on voit des phrases, on peut trouver dans une certaine position un élément A qui est tel qu'on doit avoir un élément B quelque part ailleurs dans cette phrase. Ces dépendances entre la position A et la position B existent. Il y a un certain inventaire de dépendances et leur étude est un thème central de la théorie de la syntaxe moderne. Et la présentation en 2012 portait sur l'analyse des pronoms réfléchis. Les pronoms réfléchis ont la particularité qu'ils ont besoin d'un antécédent. Donc, la relation entre un antécédent et un réfléchi représente une telle dépendance qu'on trouve dans les langues naturelles. Mais ça n'est pas la seule. C'est une dépendance qui a un certain nombre de propriétés, et en particulier des propriétés de localité très fortes, c'est-à-dire que les éléments A et B ne peuvent pas être trop distants l'un de l'autre. Quand on a présenté nos travaux sur la théorie du liage en 2012, nous n'avions donc, essayant d'analyser la nature de ces dépendances, la question posée par le professeur Rizzi et le professeur Cinque, c'était mais pourquoi est-ce que cette dépendance ressemble tellement à une autre dépendance, qui est celle d'un certain type de mouvement, mais vous n'analysez pas ça comme vous n'analysez pas la relation entre le réfléchi et son antécédent comme une relation de mouvement. Et donc, certainement, de réduire l'inventaire des dépendances de telle sorte est un agenda important pour essayer de comprendre pourquoi les dépendances qui existent et pourquoi celles qui n'existent pas n'existent pas. Et aujourd'hui, je vais présenter en partie un travail qui suggère que l'hypothèse sous-jacente à la question du professeur Rizzi et du professeur Cinque était bien fondée. C'est qu'il est possible, en fait, d'analyser cette dépendance comme une dépendance de mouvement. Donc, ça va être le thème de cette présentation. Le point de départ, c'est des phrases comme en 1C. En français, Jean est fier de lui-même. En anglais, John is proud of himself. On voit ici que l'élément lui-même a comme antécédent Jean. Lui-même veut dire Jean. Et donc, la phrase « Jean est fier de lui-même » est une phrase réfléchie. Ce même élément lui-même apparaît dans la phrase 2, « Jean lui-même est fier de Pierre », sans qu'il y ait ici une relation réfléchie. C'est ce qu'on appelle une lecture d'intensification. Quand on dit « Jean lui-même est fier de Pierre », on contraste Jean avec quelqu'un d'autre. Par exemple, peut-être que la sœur de Jean est fière de Pierre, et on dit « et même Jean lui-même est fier de Pierre ». Donc on établit un contraste entre Jean et d'autres personnes. Il n'y a pas de lecture réfléchie. Et le fait qu'on utilise le même élément soulève une question. Pourquoi utilise-t-on ce même élément pour des fonctions qui ont l'air superficiellement très différentes, non seulement du point de vue de la distribution, en 1C lui-même apparaît comme l'objet de fière, de l'adjectif, en 2 lui-même apparaît comme un modificateur du sujet. Et aussi du point de vue du sens. Le sens qui émerge dans ces deux cas est assez différent. Pourquoi utilise-t-on la même expression pour ces deux choses? Une question supplémentaire, c'est que lui-même est composé, comme himself en français, de 2 morceaux, lui et même. Et ce mot même existe ailleurs en français, de la même façon que le mot self existe ailleurs en anglais. En français, même est un adjectif qui veut dire pareil à, semblable, identique, n'est-ce pas? Et donc on a une double homophonie. On a une homophonie entre lui-même, le réfléchi, et lui-même, l'intensificateur, et on a une homophonie entre la partie même de lui-même et l'adjectif même. Est-ce que c'est un accident? Donc je vais essayer tout d'abord de vous montrer que ce n'est pas un accident, que vraiment il y a une question à poser là, et qu'il faudrait y répondre de façon claire. L'homophonie, du point de vue de l'apprentissage du langage, est une option marquée. C'est-à-dire que quand on rencontre un élément qu'on a déjà entendu, l'hypothèse nulle, c'est que cet élément qu'on a déjà entendu est le même que celui qu'on a entendu dans toutes ses propriétés. Si un principe comme ça, c'est un principe cognitif qui est assez large, qui va au-delà du langage. Si on rencontre quelqu'un, par exemple, à une réception, et qu'on revoit cette personne 3 jours plus tard dans la rue, et qu'on va vers elle et on lui dit « Ah, bonjour, comment allez-vous » et que cette personne nous dit « Mais je ne vous connais pas, monsieur », on est surpris. Parce qu'on s'attend, vu que cette personne ressemble exactement à la personne qu'on a vue auparavant, que ce soit la même personne. Ça ne nous vient pas à l'idée, naturellement, de penser que c'est, par exemple, le frère jumeau de la personne qu'on a rencontrée. Donc, par défaut, une identité d'apparence, une identité de forme amène à une identité de contenu, par hypothèse. Donc, l'homophonie, c'est pareil dans les langues. Quand on entend un mot 2 fois, on a tendance à penser que c'est le même élément avec les mêmes propriétés, sauf s'il existe, bien sûr, des données très concrètes qui montrent que ça n'est pas le cas. Par exemple, un coup de poing et le coup, on va se rendre compte assez rapidement que ce n'est pas la même chose. Mais pour des mots comme « même » qui apparaissent composés comme ça dans des expressions dont on ne comprend pas très bien les parties, c'est beaucoup plus difficile à faire. Donc, par défaut, on devrait supposer que l'homophonie indique l'identité de toutes les propriétés. Mais les accidents existent. Est-ce que cette homophonie est quand même accidentelle en français? Déjà, on voit que, et en français et en anglais, on a cette même homophonie. C'est un indice que ça n'est pas un accident. Mais si on regarde au-delà de l'anglais et du français, dans des langues qui sont génétiquement très différentes, c'est-à-dire qui n'appartiennent pas aux mêmes familles du tout, comme par exemple le maninka du Nyokolo, on retrouve la même chose. Ainsi, Denis Cressel, dans un article de 2013, note que, les exemples sont en 125, là, pour le sujet qui est intensifié, on utilise un pronom avec une particule d'intensification, comme toi-même, en 125A, et en 125B, on utilise la même chose pour le réfléchi, n'est-ce pas? Ce qui suggère que cette homophonie n'est pas accidentelle. Et même si on élargit le domaine empirique, il existe des études qui comparent un nombre important de langues, comme celle qui est illustrée dans le tableau numéro 4, en haut de la page. Et là, on voit que sur les 72 langues étudiées, 30 d'entre elles utilisent le même mot pour l'intensification et pour le réfléchi. C'est la ligne numéro 1. Vous voyez, c'est AAA. C'est le même élément qui est utilisé pour les trois. On voit même que dans les langues comme le japonais ou le tarascan, il y a identité entre le morphème, l'élément qui est utilisé pour le réfléchi et l'élément qui est utilisé pour l'intensification adverbiale. Donc on voit que, qu'est-ce que montre cette étude? Elle montre qu'il est peu plausible que cette homophonie soit accidentelle, mais elle montre aussi autre chose, c'est qu'un réfléchi et un intensificateur, ça n'est pas tout à fait la même chose. Il doit y avoir des propriétés en commun qui sont importantes, qui expliquent l'homophonie, mais il doit aussi y avoir des différences, quelque part, qui font que les deux éléments n'ont pas la même distribution, le même sens, et parfois même la même forme dans certaines langues. Il y a d'autres raisons de penser que cette homophonie n'est pas accidentelle. Il existe certaines études du changement historique, du changement diachronique, qui montrent qu'il y a un changement naturel de l'intensificateur vers le réfléchi. Donc, des études très poussées qui ont été faites sur l'anglais montrent qu'en anglais, l'ancien anglais n'avait pas de forme pour le réfléchi. Il avait une forme pour l'intensificateur qui était self. Cet intensificateur a changé dans le temps et s'est transformé en himself ou herself. Et ensuite, cet élément, himself ou herself, a commencé à être utilisé comme un réfléchi. C'était une innovation en anglais. L'existence de ce passage naturel d'une utilisation à l'autre montre qu'il y a un partage important de propriétés et que donc c'est naturel de passer de l'un à l'autre. Inversement, il existe des études qui portent sur les langues sémitiques qui montrent le trajet inverse, c'est-à-dire que dans les langues sémitiques, dans certaines langues sémitiques, l'élément qui est au départ réfléchi étend son utilisation à celle d'un intensificateur dans certaines langues. Donc on voit que l'utilisation peut basculer dans l'autre sens, s'étendre dans l'autre sens, ce qui contribue à indiquer que cette homophonie n'est pas accidentelle. Finalement, il existe, et ça c'est peut-être un argument particulièrement frappant, l'homophonie qu'on observe entre lui-même intensificateur et lui-même réfléchi, ou himself intensificateur et himself réfléchi, n'est pas limitée à ces éléments-là en anglais et en français. Il existe d'autres éléments complètement distincts, historiquement, qui montrent la même ambiguïté. Ainsi, si vous regardez les phrases en 5, par exemple en anglais, « The moon triggers its own tide », cette lecture-là peut être une lecture réfléchie, c'est-à-dire que la Lune déclenche les marées de la Lune. Donc la Lune apparaît 2 fois, c'est une lecture réfléchie. Mais dans une phrase comme 5b, « Sue tied her own shoes », ça peut vouloir dire que Sue a lacé ses chaussures toute seule. Donc on voit que cet élément « own » peut déclencher une lecture réfléchie en 5a ou bien une lecture intensifiée en 5b. C'est la même chose avec l'élément français « propre ». Dans « La Lune suit sa propre orbite », lecture réfléchie. Dans « Henri a créé son propre site Internet », lecture possible où Henri a créé son site Internet tout seul. Lecture non réfléchie. Donc, conclusion, il y a des similarités profondes entre les réfléchis et les intensificateurs, et ces similarités profondes donc, exigent, d'un point de vue analytique, une analyse unifiée. Et donc, c'est ce que je vais essayer de proposer aujourd'hui, une analyse unifiée de ces éléments qui permet de comprendre pourquoi ces éléments ont ces propriétés, les propriétés qu'elles ont, bien qu'elles soient construites sur le même moule, n'est-ce pas? Donc ce que je vais faire, c'est que je vais d'abord donner une liste des propriétés de ces éléments. C'est des éléments qui ont été très étudiés, on sait beaucoup de choses, les propriétés sont assez complexes et techniques. Ensuite, je vais présenter de façon assez brève une analyse de l'intensification pour himself. Ensuite, je passerai à l'analyse de lui-même ou de himself comme réfléchi. Et finalement, si le temps le permet, je discuterai de l'analyse des ce qu'on appelle des self-predicates. Okay? Qu'est-ce que sont les self-predicates? Ce sont des éléments qui incorporent l'élément self. Ça peut se faire en anglais, mais pas en français. En français, il y a une façon de le faire, mais qui est un peu différente. Et c'est illustré par les exemples en 8. Donc vous voyez l'exemple 8a. John self-identifies as Scottish. Jean s'identifie comme écossais. C'est une lecture réfléchie. Le verbe identifier, ici, a un préfixe, self, qui donne cette lecture réfléchie, n'est-ce pas? A self-produced concert, en 8b, ça, c'est un concert qui est produit par quelqu'un lui-même, quelqu'un tout seul. Cette lecture-là, qui est obtenue avec self-produced concert, c'est une lecture intensifiée. Donc on voit, encore une fois, qu'il y a une ambiguïté possible sur le sens apporté par l'élément self. Ça peut déclencher une lecture réfléchie ou une lecture intensifiée, tout seul, sans pronom, sans le him de himself. Et donc, l'existence de ces formes rend le défi qui est posé par une analyse unifiée encore plus difficile à satisfaire parce que les propriétés, comme on va le voir, des self-predicates sont assez différentes, qu'elles soient réfléchies ou intensifiées, des propriétés des réfléchis comme himself ou des intensifieurs comme himself. Donc, maintenant, je vais passer à l'anglais. Et donc, I'm going to start listing some properties that these elements have that need to be accounted for by any analysis. Right? So, English elements of the form ex-self or French elements of the form lui-même display a number of properties which should all be derived from the right analysis. So first of all, the morphosyntax, these elements are composed of two pieces, a pronoun and this morpheme self for English, or a pronoun and the element même for French, for example. Now, they can be used as intensifiers. As intensifiers, they can occur either ad nominally, modifying a nominal, like John himself, or as an adverbial, like John bought the book himself, right? And they display a variety of readings. They don't have always the same readings. As adnominal intensifiers, they induce a contrast with others. So if I say, Layla herself was there, what I'm saying is that Layla was there unlike some other person, or relevant, or Layla was there in addition to some other person. Okay? So this is just a contrast between individuals. But when these elements are used as adverbials, they can have a different meaning. In fact, two kinds of different meanings that have led previous authors to postulate different lexical entries for intensifiers. The first one is called the anti-delegative reading. So this is under little I in this bullet point here. So Layla baked it herself can be an answer to what did Layla do to get her baked cake? So what we are saying here is that Layla is the sole baker, right? Not just Layla is the sole person, Layla is the sole baker. The other one is in 2 here. This is called the anti-assistive reading. If I say Layla found her way herself, this can have a meaning where it says that Layla found her way without help. right? So these are 3 different readings that have led authors in general to postulate up to 3 different lexical entries for intensifiers. If we want to explain why we have this homophony, this is not an option that is open to the analysis. We have to do differently. In addition to this, adnominal and adverbial intensifier display different so-called sortal restrictions. They don't combine with the same things. So whereas in this example up here, No king did it himself is reported as a fine sentence. No king himself did it is reported as deviant. And so this puts another burden on a unified analysis to explain why it is that these things don't combine with the same things. So this is for intensifiers, a small corner of the properties that we need to account for. When they're used as reflexive, they have a number of extremely well documented properties, especially for English, which is a language that is very deeply studied and in particular in recent years with a lot of experimental results concerning how these elements behave. So the first of all, reflexive of that sort, they participate in a dependency, the thing that I mentioned at the beginning. They must have a local antecedent within some local domain, right? So we had argued in that 2012 presentation that the domain was technically the smallest phase containing them. So first thing. Second, the antecedent that they have must have the same referential value. Overlap between the antecedent and the reflexive is not enough. They have to have the same value. When they occur in elided construction, they show both what's called sloppy identity and strict identity. So in a sentence like 10a, up here, whoop, John defended himself before Bill did. The second part, which misses a portion, is ambiguous. It can mean John defended himself before Bill defended himself, or John defended himself before Bill defended John, the latter being the strict identity reading. This is also true in 10b, as shown by very clear experimental results. John blamed himself for this failure, as did everyone else. So, as did everyone else blamed himself or themselves. Or, as did everyone else blamed John, right? Same thing with C. I'm going to skip the example. They show what's called proxy readings. Okay, these are situations where the semantic value is not quite the same between the antecedent and and the reflexive. So these examples are famous. They're due to Ray Jackendoff. The scenario is that Ringo, the Beatle, visits the Madame Tussauds Museum in London and sees a statue of himself. It's a wax statue. And he trips and falls on the statue. And it's possible to describe what happened as saying, Ringo, the person, fell on himself, the statue. So here we see that himself can refer to the statue, not quite Ringo, but something that represents Ringo. The converse is difficult, it's not possible. So it's not possible if the statue of Ringo falls on Ringo, the person, to report this by saying Ringo fell on himself. Ringo, the wax statue, fell on Ringo, the person. So there is an asymmetry here that needs to be also accounted for. I probably won't have time to go through that. They show particular kind of intentional properties that I will come back to in the next section. And then they show other properties that I listed here so that if you feel like reading this handout, later you get a sense of other properties to account for, but I won't have time to talk about this. Nor will I have time to talk about point 4, because it's also a fact that reflexives like himself and lui-même can be used in a non-anaphoric way when they are used logophorically with particular properties. So this lies beyond the scope of this presentation. Now let's turn to bare self, the self that occurs in reflexive predicates. In reflexive predicates, we get reflexive readings. That's in 1 here. Okay, so self-identify or self-immolate, we saw that. We get intensifying reading. So I also mentioned this, but here is an example. This senator self-funded this campaign. That means this senator funded this campaign alone, by himself. Or nations now self-insure their oil tanker, the oil tankers they acquire. It means they insure the oil tankers they acquire themselves. Right? So these are intensifying readings. These are found on the web, by the way. In ellipsis construction, unlike what happens with himself, self-predicates require sloppy identity. So if you look at example 12 here, Eli wanted to self-immolate and Samuel did too. This can only mean that Samuel wanted to self-immolate as well. It cannot mean that Samuel wanted to immolate Eli. That's not an option, right? No proxy readings are allowed. So Ringo, looking at this statue in the Tussauds Museum, Ringo self-identifies as the self-beetle. What he must have done is, I am the fourth beetle. He couldn't have said, pointing to the statue, this is me, this is me, the fourth beetle. If we use the verb self-identify, self-identify has to be about him, the person. Okay? So this is a distinction with pronouns like himself. Now, himself and bare self also differ in intensional properties. Now, I'm going to illustrate this. Imagine the scenario that's given in 15. Eli, the high priest, wants to placate the gods by sacrificing a member of the community. He says, I want to immolate the oldest member of the community, who, he does not realize, is him. But I know it's him. I can truly report what happened by saying, Eli wants to immolate himself. That's true, even though Eli is not aware of this. But I could not report truly what happened by saying, Eli wants to self-immolate. If I said that, it would have to be the case that Eli knows that the person he wants to immolate is him. Right? So we have what's called, intentional differences. To describe what happens in 15a, we say that co-reference between Eli and himself can be read de re, true for the speaker, but not de dicto, true for Eli. Whereas 15b must be read, the co-reference must be read de dicto. It has to be true for Eli. Right? So these are properties that we need to account for. Right? I'm going to skip 4.3. 4.3 would be a survey of existing analyses to see how they fare with respect to explaining all these properties without postulating lexical ambiguities for self. I don't think they managed to do this, but I'm going to assume that it's the case here. and I'm going to move to the analysis. Okay, so an analysis that tries to meet this challenge. Okay. So the idea of the analysis is that the même, or the self that occurs in himself or lui-même, is a binary predicate of identity. So it's just like the adjective même, right? So A is the same as B. That's what it says, right? So this is illustrated, for example, in 16b here. So self here takes two arguments. Here a pronoun, him, and then a second argument, John, right? And it says, John is him. That's what it means. John is him. John is the same as him. In other words, this element self takes him as argument and returns as value this argument. So this is exactly like John is him, right? So I'm going to conclude that this is what happens. It's consistent with certain analyses of intensifiers, as I'm going to show you now. Okay? And I'm going to start with intensifiers. Why? Because unlike what happens with reflexives, there is only fundamentally one analysis for intensifiers in the literature. People disagree, but only at the margins. Whereas when it comes to reflexive, there are very, very broad disagreement about the right analysis. Now, if we start with intensifiers where the analytical options are extremely restricted, and then we take as desideratum the idea that the same item exactly is used in reflexive, that puts very severe boundary conditions on what kind of analysis is acceptable for reflexives. So this is why I adopt this strategy here. So I'm going to start with a representative analysis, that of Regina Eckart from 2001. And it's about German Selbst, which is the cognate of English self. Then I will adapt it to English, because English does not use self by itself. It uses himself or itself. And then I will extend it to account for anaphoric reflexive itself, and then, if time permits, to self-predicates. All right. So intensified DPs. So consider sentence 18. Karl selbst ist gekommen in German, which means exactly Karl himself came. What's Eckart's analysis? She takes selbst in German to be the identity function. That is, it takes an argument and returns the same argument. In other words, Karl selbst just means Karl. So Karl selbst ist gekommen just means Karl is gekommen. So why use self? The contribution of self seems to be zero here. Well, it's zero. It's actually not quite true. So there's a footnote about this, but it can be zero. But if we accent selbst, then this has an effect. If selbst is accented, it's focused. Karl selbst ist gekommen, and that's the way you have to say it in German, just like in English, Karl himself came. Himself is accented. It triggers a focus meaning. It's a special meaning. It triggers alternatives to the focused element that yield sentences that contrast with the original sentence. So when you say Karl himself came, this triggers alternatives on Karl. So for example, Hans, and then Hans did not come. This is the effect of focus meaning. Okay? So what are, because self is accented, how does this meaning arise? Well, what are, self is accented, so it triggers alternatives to self, right? He's saying self, not something that is not self. Self is a function of identity. It says A equals B. Therefore, alternatives are functions of non-identity. A is not B, right? When you combine a function of not identity with Carl, that gives you somebody else, somebody who is not Carl, Hans, right? So that's how the meaning of Carl selbst ist gekommen is derived. Accent on selbst triggers alternative. Alternatives are function of non-identity. Applied to Carl, it returns people who are not Carl, and they don't have the property that the sentence says. Okay? It's a very nice, simple analysis, and derives exactly what happens in these cases. So, if we assumed that himself in English functions exactly like selbst in German, we explain the meaning of Carl himself came, right? Now, we will need to say, how is it that in English we have himself, but in German we have only der selbst? That's the next section, okay? But assuming that himself is just like selbst, then we understand how the meaning of Carl himself came arises, okay? Now, with this idea, it's possible, unlike what Eckhart does, to derive the other intensifying meaning, the adverbial meaning, that is, the anti-delegative meaning or the anti-assistive meaning, without postulating different lexical entries. And this is what is discussed in this blue part here. But if I went through this, I would not be able to talk about reflexives. So it's on the handout. I can talk about this during the question period if you want, but I will skip it here. But it can be done. How about the sortal differences? Remember that, you know, I pointed out that people say the himself here cannot be the same as the himself here because Knocking himself did it is bad, but Knocking did it himself is fine. We believe that this is a pragmatically driven difference. It's not that Knocking himself did it is syntactically or semantically ill-formed. It's just that the burden that needs to be met to construct a relevant interpretation has to provide alternatives in the context for each king. So if you just say out of the blue, Knocking himself did it, it's hard to see because, well, for each king, who are the alternatives? We don't know. But if contextually we supply these alternatives, then the sentences become fine. So look at 22b. Okay? So I build up a context a little bit. We expected the queens to each dispatch a representative to this minor celebration. But surprisingly, every queen herself was present. Right? So this is a much better sentence. Why? Because for each queen now, we have a plausible alternative in the context, namely the representative that this queen could have sent to this minor this minor event, right? So we think it's pragmatically driven rather than semantically or syntactically driven. So this is not a problem. Now, how does English herself end up with German selbst? Okay? So there are two things that we need to do. The first thing is that we want himself to function like selbst, right? In order to derive the meaning of Carl himself came. But in addition to this, der self functions like der German selbst. If we compare the behavior of self-predicates in German and in French, in English, they function the same. That suggests that English self should also function like German selbst, right? So we need to meet these two requirements simultaneously, okay? So we start from 23, that was our sentence. Let's try to think 1 minute about what's happening syntactically here. In German, selbst is an adjective. It takes Carl as argument. But if nothing else happens, Carl selbst should be an adjectival phrase. But an adjectival phrase cannot occur as subject like this. Things that can occur as subject must be determiner phrases. So we need to do something to this constituent to turn it into something that can occur as subject. And the standard thing to do here is to syntactically type shift Karl selbst to transform it into a DP. It's what's called relativization. We have to relativize Karl so as to construct a DP out of this constituent here. So we construct a DP, like here. Karl, who is Karl? And now this is a DP, and this is what occurs here, right? So there is some syntax hidden in this constituent here. It's not just a function selbst adjectival taking as argument Karl a DP. It must be more complex. Okay? Now let's turn to English. In English, we want to understand the structure of that thing, Leila herself. Now, this constituent contains 4 distinct DPs. The first one is the big one, Leila herself. This behaves, it can be a subject. So this behaves like a DP. Its head is Leila. Leila is also a DP. Her, this is the pronoun her. It is a DP. And finally, herself here, this is also behaves like a DP. So we have 4 DPs. Okay? So we have these 4 things. And we want to construct this constituent on the basis of the idea that self here, somewhere, is the identity function. Right? That's the conclusion from the analysis of intensifiers that is current, right, that I described. So how can we do this? Okay? So the suggestion here is that just like mem in English, which takes 2 arguments, self also takes 2 arguments. So you start with a structure like 26 up here. Leila, self, her. Her is the first argument of self. They combine. The meaning of self, her is her, because self is the identity function on her. And then this is predicated of Leila. So this means Leila is her. That's what it means. Okay? From this structure, we want to construct this DP. Okay? So how do we do it? It's actually done slightly differently in English and French. I'm just going to talk about the English version here. So what you do is you start from this small clause here, and the first thing you do is you transform it into a DP to form herself, because recall, herself functions like a DP. How do you do that in English? You relativize the predicate. That is, you take self, her. Self is a noun in English, and you form a relative. So something roughly like the self of her that Leila is, right? Herself that Leila is. That's kind of what you do when you do this. And this is this first arrow here, right? The arrow that goes from the predicate, self, her, to here. And so you construct this relative clause. And then you need to have Leila here, but Leila is an argument of self. It's the second argument. And so if it appears here, you've moved it from this position, subject of self, to form a second relative clause, right? So this structure, Leila herself, is built on the basis of a small clause where the main predicate is self, a predicate of identity, by double relativization, right? What's the meaning associated with this? Oh, let me say, so self, her, this is what's going to be realized as herself, right? We relativize out of a relative clause. You could think this violates constraints on islands, but it doesn't, because small clause relatives are not islands, as is discussed in work by Richie Kane, 2010. And one thing that we have to say, and I will come back to it perhaps if I have time. Leila here is mandated to move. It cannot stay in this position. It has to move. Fundamentally, it's a case problem. I'm not sure I will have time to discuss it. What's the meaning of this? Well, so if we read the meaning of the tree, this says, Leila, the self of her that Leila is, right? Literally. Leila, who is the self of her who Leila is. So Leila, her who Leila is. This is redundant, right? So despite the fact that the structure is much more complicated, we still have this semantic redundancy that is at the core of Eckart's analysis. And so in order to have a meaningful contribution to, of self here, we need to accent it, right? Accenting will trigger focal alternatives and will give rise to the right meaning. This is described here, but it's in blue. I'm going to skip it, right? So fundamentally now that's the analysis of intensifiers, where we take self to be a predicate of identity, and from which we derive the intensifying meaning that you observe with things like Leila herself. Okay? French lui-même functions slightly differently, in part because whereas self is a noun in modern English, it used to be an adjective, même is an adjective. And so there is an analytical option that's not possible because that constituent in French is not an NP, it is an AP. So you cannot proceed this way in French, you have to proceed differently. But the result in the end is the same. Okay? So that's for intensifiers, right? So you see what happened is we start from this structure, Leila is self-her, we relativize self-her, the self-her Leila is, and then Leila moves out, and this is pronounced herself, right? Now what's the difference with reflexives? Reflexives, they start exactly in the same way. That is, they start with this constituent, but unlike what happens in the case of intensifiers, this element here, Leila, which has to move out, instead of being relativized, as here, it is moved to become the subject of a different predicate. You move the subject to a theta position, right? So if this verb here was introduce, this here is read as herself. Leila was inside here. It moves to subject position, and so the meaning that you derive is Leila introduced herself. In other words, intensifiers and reflexives share quite a bit of structure, but they are not identical. They're very close. They have the same core pattern based on the same predicate of identity, self, même. What differs between them is where you move the first argument of this predicate of identity. If you relativize it, you get intensification. If you move it so that it becomes the argument of another predicate, then you get the reflexive reading. Okay? That's the gist of the analysis. Okay? Now, let me check briefly that this analysis gets the properties that we said reflexives have. Okay? So, anaphoricity. So, unlike in standard binding theory, there is no notion of anaphor in this analysis. There is no notion of anaphor, right? There is not a category of anaphor that has to be defined. The only thing that happens here is movement of some element somewhere, right? An option that is in principle allowed, and what it does, it gives rise to the reflexive reading, okay? Why is it that we observe the anaphoric property, that is that a reflexive has to have a local antecedent? Well, that's the answer to Luigi Rizzi's question. What happens here is that the relation between the reflexive and its antecedent is a relation of a movement. It's a particular kind of movement. So this type of dependency that we observe between a reflexive and an antecedent is subsumed under another category of dependency, namely a movement, and it therefore inherits the properties of a movement, in particular the fundamental property of locality. A movement is a local dependency in exactly the right way, right? And therefore, we don't need to state an independent condition regulating the locality of the dependency between a reflexive and its antecedent, condition A of the binding theory. We don't need to state it. This is a byproduct of the fact that movement is involved. Identity under ellipsis. Why is it that we can observe strict identity under ellipsis? So look at 33a. John defended himself before Bill did. Right? John, in subject position of defend, has a trace. It has a trace inside the direct object, inside himself, right? Traces are copies, and copies have the same, that is, they have the same content as what's moved. So what happened with the strict reading in 33a is simply that this copy can be retained when you compute the meaning of the elided constituent. Right? Instead of replacing John in the elided constituent by a trace of Bill, you can decide that the antecedent of the elided material is actually defended himself John. That's going to give you the strict reading. This is not required. The sloppy reading is also available, but we derive naturally the existence of the strict reading under this kind of a movement where you move something to a theta position, something that is not normally allowed under a movement because a movement is typically towards a theta bar position, a non-argument position. If you try to play the same trick with standard a movement, you would end up with a structure that is not interpretable, precisely because there is only one theta role involved instead of two. So if you look at 33b and you try to do it, John seems to have left before Bill did. You cannot interpret this as before Bill did seem to have John left. And the reason is that Bill is not linked to any theta position here. So the sentence is not interpretable. I'm going to skip proxy reading just for reasons of time. Intentional properties. Recall what we saw with respect to intentional properties. When you have coreference between a reflexive and an antecedent, this coreference, it's enough that it be true for the speaker, even though it's not true for some other person that is represented in the sentence. Okay? Well, here, the coreference between a reflexive and its antecedent is really a relation between him of himself and the antecedent, two DPs. Two DPs that have the same value. Now, when you have two DPs that have the same value because they are both arguments of a predicate like mem or same, you observe that this property is actually allowed. Okay? So, I'll give you an example. This is in 36. The scenario is John, who knows nothing about Sue's last year trip, points to a boat and says, this boat is the Chaire. Turns out that the Chaire is the boat Sue took last year, which I know, but he doesn't. I can truly report what John said by saying, John thinks that this boat is the same boat that Sue took last year. This is true, even though John is not aware of it, right? So this is a case where this boat and the boat Sue took last year is the same boat for me, the speaker, but not for John. And this is what happens as for the relation between John and him in John introduced himself. That's possible too, right? For exactly the same reason. Why is there exhaustive binding? That is, why is it that the antecedent and the reflexive have to have the same value? Well, because they're both argument of a predicate of identity, right? Fundamentally, the sentence is saying, John is him. So, of course, they have to be the same thing. Overlap in reference is not good enough. They have to have the same semantic value, right? So I'm going to say very briefly now what happens with self-predicates. There are all sorts of technical questions that arise. The handout tries to provide answers to these questions. It should be, I hope, self-contained. Let me move to this section 7 here, bare self. Right? I'm going to take 5 minutes to give you the gist of the analysis. So, recall that self, bare, when it's prefixed to predicates, can give rise to reflexive readings. Originalism is self-refuting. It refutes itself. Or to intensifying reading. This senator self-funded his campaign, right? One question is the prefixing of self to predicate a lexical process? So at a minimum, I think it can't be always a lexical process. And there are two reasons for this. One is that there are cases in which self incorporates superficially, is prefixed to a verb. It is not an argument of. Therefore, that rules out a lexical incorporation derivation. Okay, so if you look at a case like A here, a self-proclaimed king, this means one who proclaimed himself king, right? And you see that himself here is not an argument of proclaim. It's a semantic argument of king. But self, if it occurs here, would incorporate to the verb proclaim, even though it's not a lexical argument of proclaim. That can't be due to a lexical process. First reason. Second reason, these cases with intensification, because self here, which has an intensifying reading, bears no lexical relation whatsoever with the predicate. Right? This is an adverb of some sort, an adverb of intensification. Okay? So this could not possibly be a lexical process. Right? It has to be a syntactic process, which means that at least there are some cases where it's a syntactic process of incorporation or prefixation. And so we need to account for what's going on in syntactic terms. Okay, so let's look now at this one. Eli wanted to self-immolate. Okay, recall one fundamental property that these things have is that the reflexive relation has to be read de dicto. That is, the relation between the immolator and the person to be immolated of coreference has to be true for Eli, and of course for me, the speaker. In other words, the DP subject of immolate and the DP object of immolate are not allowed to have distinct references, distinct denotations for anyone. It has to be the same for everybody. There is only one way that I know to ensure this result. And the only way that I know is that this DP, there has to be only a single DP that occurs in the two positions, right? The moment you have distinct DPs, there is no way to guarantee that their value is the same for everyone. They can diverged in some worlds, to speak more technically. All right? How can we guarantee that these two DPs, there is only a single DP that occurs in the as the two arguments of the predicate self? Well, the only way that I know is that they are in a movement relationship. In other words, when you have bare self, what happens is that the first argument of self here moves to become the second argument of self, right? So there is a single DP, technically, that occurs in both positions. Therefore, they cannot diverge in reference, right? And so what happens then is self incorporates, okay? It's prefixed, and we want to know why it has to incorporate in such cases in English. But fundamentally, I wanted to get to this point because that's the gist of the analysis, both for the reflexive reading and also for the intensifying reading. Same thing. We're going to have self taking as two arguments the same object. That's going to give rise to the necessary coreference between the two arguments for every possible attitude holder. It will block the possibility of having proxy readings. Proxy readings can only occur if the two arguments of self denote slightly different things. But here it's not possible because these two things are the same syntactic object. They have to denote exactly the same thing, so that excludes proxy readings. All right? So fundamentally, that's the the essence of the proposal. Here is an overall summary, okay, of the proposal. On the left, the intensifying structure. On the right, the reflexive structure. A shared substructure in both cases. They only differ in what happens to the second argument of the identity function, self. And in the case of bare self, the two arguments of the self predicate are in a movement relationship which limits their freedom to denote. They have to denote exactly the same thing. That's it. Thank you very much.